This is Duke University.
Okay, thanks a lot for coming out. As you can see, so what you can see is that we're going to talk about the global production and marketing of athletes today. What you can't see is that this is a part of, and we are the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and that's our snazzy new logo indicating that we're 15 years old now. So we're like 6 years from being able to hand out alcohol at our events, I guess. I am Wayne Norman. I teach in philosophy and in the Kenan Institute here. The real sort of brains behind here, sort of hiding like the Wizard of Oz behind the camera over there. Pay no attention to the woman behind the camera. Is Rebecca Dunning, who has really set up, most of this series, and she's worked on them throughout the summer. She's really responsible for the terrific panel of guests that we have today. So that's this event. This event is really the first in a four-part series. So each year, the Kenan Institute for Ethics has a four-part series called What is Ethics? And in the past, they've sort of done a diverse range of topics. This year, all four of the events, 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. There is no winter, by the way, in North Carolina, and those of you who arrived here recently. 2 in the spring will be themed, have different sorts of sports themes. So this one's about the production and marketing of athletes on a global scale. And the next one is about kind of rules. It's called Bending the Rules, Gamesmanship in Sport. Could be called Gamesmanship and Rule Following in Sport and Other Parts of Life. And that will be the next event. It's about 1 month from now on a Thursday afternoon. Some great guests coming in for that. And we have 2 events in the spring that aren't yet determined. So if there's particular themes, we're leaning in a couple of directions. We're thinking about the coaching and leadership, perhaps kind of mental and physical enhancement of athletes, and where to draw lines for rules and sportsmanship, etc. Well, anyway, we're leaning towards a couple of topics. If you have other interests, then feel free to let us know. And we still have enough time to sort of set things and work on getting participants. So normally I wasn't around for the initial discussions Rebecca had with Suzanne Shanahan, who's the Associate Director of Kenan. Normally when we think about ethics in sport, we think about something like this. This was a New Yorker cover from last year, just shortly after A-Rod was outed on his positive steroid test. So we worry in particular about the way in which, one of the topics that comes up perennially when we quickly think about ethics in sport is the way in which sort of athletes can have various effects on society. So here you have all these little squirts who have obviously been juicing as well. And we can talk about that. Maybe that will be sort of a sub-part of one of the 4 events. But there's a much broader range of topics that are of interest in the university, that have ethical implications, and that involve sport. And by coincidence, while Rebecca and Suzanne were sort of setting up this series and idea, Claire, who is Claire here? I didn't see her walk in. So Claire Conceição in theater was getting a grant from the humanities, the Franklin Humanities Institute, is that the right name? To kind of find a network of professors at Duke who do something in their day job but think a lot about sports and actually find that it's pretty connected to some of the stuff that they do in their day job, and in some cases are even sort of bringing it into their day job. And so we've been able to tap into that network, and at least a couple of the people that will be speaking here today are sort of founding members of that group. And really one could say that what that group is about is sort of taking sports seriously in the academy. So we take a lot of other things seriously. This just got shared with me on Facebook today, so I'm going to share one. So we take things like art and science and mathematics and business seriously, and so this sort of relates sports, math, and art. The first one says sports is math for people who hate nerds, and math is art for people who hate artists, and art is sport for people who hate themselves. So we take these other things seriously, but somehow sport is always sort of left as the more frivolous of the human endeavors. that doesn't seem to merit intrinsic academic attention. It merits attention if it has some other effect, like a public policy implication. If too many kids are taking steroids, then Congress starts to worry about the model role that athletes are playing. We also do a lot of this in all of our academic disciplines. So all of the members of this study group that Claire put together have confessed that they have used sports examples all the time in their work, although they haven't necessarily written about sports. So I'm sure we'll hear a few sports metaphors, and that's, in a way, that's what interested me in this topic academically. I do a lot of work on democratic theory, and I do a lot of work on business firms and markets. And both of those are examples of what we can call deliberately competitive institutions. So we set up a bunch of rules and we monitor them, and then we ask the players to play to win, to make the most profit, to drive the others out of business, to win the election. And then we hope that by having those competitions in these special kinds of institutions, that society as a whole will benefit. And so sports is not just a metaphor, but it's actually kind of a little laboratory. In fact, we have all these different sports with all of these different kinds of rules, all of these different ways of monitoring them, all of these different historical progressions, all of these different cultures that form within the sport. And we can learn from some of those. And I think we'll do a little bit more of that next week. But this time we're actually talking about not just the way sports is like business, say, or is like other kinds of competition, but actually we're talking about the way sports is business. So we're actually talking about, sports is a very good example of a particular kind of global business, and that by following the kinds of transactions that happen and the way in which athletes get made, the way in which athletes are marketed, bought and sold, literally, it allows us to see an aspect, or sort of study very closely an aspect of our globalized world, to use that ridiculous expression, in a way that sort of disappears sometimes when we spend too much time looking at the WTO or the United Nations or wars or something like that. Okay, so that's enough from me. The only other sports metaphor I'll use comes from this week's New Yorker cartoon. New Yorker is pretty reliable for having sports metaphor cartoons. This may have been drawn by the same artist as the last one. So each of our panelists, we have 4 of them, and I think what I'll do, I'll introduce them very quickly now, but I think I'll introduce them before they speak. But mainly what I'll ask them to do is, in a sense, take about 30 seconds to introduce themselves and the relationship between the kind of work that they do normally in their day job as academics and the way in which they reach over to sport. And then they'll tell us something about what they think about the global production and marketing of athletes. And so we have here Laurent Dubois from Romance Studies and History. Do you actually have an office in that building right next door?
I do, yeah.
Well, so I've been here for 3 years, and I met him 5 times in the last week, but I didn't realize that we, in fact, were right beside each other. And visiting from South Africa, and also a visiting professor in Romance Studies here, is Achille Mbembe. Sorry. And are you originally from Cameroon?
I was born in Cameroon.
And they're going to talk, I think, in and around sort of what we learned from global soccer markets. Following them will be Kim Kravik, is that how you pronounce it, who's in the law school, who, she'll introduce what she does, but apparently she's fascinated by, weird isn't the expression you use.
It is.
Weird, okay, weird markets, forbidden markets. And so when we're talking about, soccer academies in Africa training players and then selling them for millions of dollars that don't go to the player themselves, we're talking about one of these weird quasi-forbidden markets that looks a lot like things that we make illegal elsewhere. And then batting cleanup is Michael Gillespie, mixing metaphors because he's a former halfback football player. He's been sort of the chief academic overseer of Duke Athletics until recently, which meant that he got to watch football games in the shade, even with air conditioning, I think, which would have been really helpful. Which would have been really nice. I don't think about that last weekend, but the most shameful thing is I walked out of that stadium and the right side of my face was crimson, which is like the worst possible color on a particular day. I think that's all of you. So without further ado, I'll just give one little plug to Laurent here. So Laurent mounted this blog last year on soccer, politics, politics of football that he did in conjunction with a course, and it was kind of a blogging course, and then they kept it going, of course, for the World Cup. And if you just actually scroll back down and look at all of their dispatches, including Laurent's from South Africa and the World Cup, it's fascinating reading. And Laurent, because he may be too modest to admit it, but he also released a book this year which has a great interview on Salon, by the way. If you don't think you have time to read the book this term, you can go to salon.com and there's an interview with him about the book Soccer Empire, which is about sort of globalization and the French national soccer team. Without further ado, then let me just ask Laurent.
All right. Well, thank you, Wayne and Rebecca, for organizing this. It's great to be able to talk about this. I started working on sport a few years ago, in particular in relation to my interest in French and French Empire and contemporary France. And as Wayne said, I taught a course last fall called World Cup and World Politics, and started this blog, Soccer Politics. And it's been a really fascinating time and experience, so it's great to be able to talk about this some more. I'm going to focus today really on the global economy of soccer or football, and the relationship particularly between Africa and Europe, but also Latin America, something I think Achille will also bring up. And I wanted to open by just saying that one of the first things to know is that in some ways the U.S. The U.S. model of professionalization through universities, right, the professional sport through universities, is in a way, in a kind of global context, a bit of an outlier. In other words, it's different from most other places, right, which don't have that conduit. In other words, in most places, the universities do not serve as conduits into athletics. So actually, the most useful comparison or metaphor or comparison with the United States is actually the baseball economy, which actually functions a little bit like what I'm going to be talking about today. And interestingly, has another parallel, which is this kind of history of empire in sport, since baseball in the Caribbean is in the kind of the history of Dominican and Cuban baseball is of course tied to U.S. occupations and U.S. influence in the Caribbean, which kind of goes on, and so you can think about that as a possible comparison. I want to first just suggest some ways in which the stuff that I'm going to talk about the present day has a long history, in the sense that actually the kind of recruitment of athletes from places in Africa and elsewhere began in the French case, and I'm going to use a lot of examples from the French case because that's what I worked on, but this can be expanded to some extent in other areas. So as early as the 20s and 30s, French athletic teams began recruiting players from places like Algeria, West Africa, especially. So in other words, they're going to their own colonies, right? They're colonies that they control, and they're finding young players who they're bringing in. The story I like to tell about this because it seems so contemporary in some ways is that in the 1930s there was a young man named Larbi Ben Barak who grew up playing football in the streets of Casablanca, was an incredible player, ended up playing on a kind of local regional tournament for a Moroccan selection, and he was recruited by Olympique de Marseille, which was a big French team. The story is interesting because he was brought from Morocco to Marseille in a ship, with a first-class ticket. So this is a guy who was, quite poor growing up. First-class ticket, treated like a king on the ship. And when he arrived in Marseille, he had to sneak out the bottom, with the cargo, because there were several other teams trying to grab him and recruit them with these recruiting deals. So there's already, this is like the late 1930s, already this kind of sense of certain athletes being incredibly important commodities. And he went on to have a very big career in Europe at that time. There was actually a funny article later because he was eventually transferred. He had earned the biggest transfer fee from France to Spain. And one journalist said that France should sell the Eiffel Tower, but they shouldn't sell this player, right? So he's also this national treasure. Another aspect of this, which I think is the fact of having all these professional players from North Africa actually came to play in very important ways during decolonization. It was one of the big kind of political gestures that the Algerian Revolution did, was to create a national football team. So they were fighting for independence from France. And what they did is they essentially sort of secretly recruited a bunch of very prominent Algerian athletes who were playing in French professional teams, who were in France, and many of them were married to French women and were kind of, again, celebrated in France as athletes. They left France and then went to Morocco, actually, and formed an Algerian team, and kind of toured around playing as a kind of, representative for this revolution. So in that case, at least, an anti-colonial movement kind of took advantage of the fact that there was this market for athletes in order to make it a political point. And it's one of probably the most potent examples of the way sport and politics can mix at a certain point. Now, decolonization created new patterns and possibilities, of course, for these markets, but in some ways, what we see between Europe and Africa is based on this earlier period, so that's important to realize. Europe remains and is very much the center of the footballing industry in the world. It is the place to which all players aspire to go. It is the place with the highest salaries. It's true both from Latin America as well. And there's a kind of consistent issue, which is, of course, it does pull from local leagues in Africa or Argentina and Brazil, and that's kind of pulls them into Europe. This obviously has implications for international tournaments, but I'll talk less about that. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, you have these kind of conjoined developments where you have decolonization and also an increasing intense development in Europe of football academies, right? And different countries have different levels of state involvement in this. France is actually the most extreme in the sense that the French state really heavily subsidizes these. And part of the idea was essentially countries wanted to produce crops of really strong athletes, right? They wanted to sustain kind of the production of the excellence in national sport. And the way these kind of work, at least in the French case, is that they basically, when kids are about 13 or 14, they might get selected to go to a football academy, which is run by a professional team, but with state support in some aspects, and which serves as a kind of like boarding school, basically, for future athletes, right? And it can again start very early, like 12, 13 sometimes. So they continue to do their degrees in high school, but they're basically already in some ways in a contract relationship with the professional team, in that they basically agreed that when they come out of this academy, if the team wants them, they have to play for that team. And if another team wants them, that other team has to pay the academy for the training they've received, right? So you do have people who are effectively in this kind of contractual relationship at a very young age that can play out overall. Now, most of the people who go to these academies don't make it in professional sports, and that's another part of the issue, right? That, of course, they do come out with high school degrees, but ones that are sort of tailored, were tailored obviously to academics, and in many ways. There's a great film that talks about Zidane, sort of the great French footballer, and the class that he went through in this academy, and essentially it's like he is, one of the great footballers of the 20th century, and basically nobody else he went to school with had any kind of career in professional footballing and worked for the post office or whatever, so it's kind of interesting. The other thing about I think that sort of to really emphasize as we move towards the present is that in the 1990s there's a couple of things that make salaries in athletics really skyrocket, and they're kind of conjoined developments. The first is basically the privatization of television in Europe, which means that suddenly there's a lot more money coming into teams who can sell rights to so television moved from being public to private. People like Berlusconi, and there's several big people in Europe who kind of oversee that process. And a lot of them are involved in both media and sport. And then at the same time, a very important, I'm Belgian, so I always like to point out important Belgians in history, and there's this guy who was not a very good soccer player, but had a big influence on soccer, who was named Mark Bosman, who complained about a feature of the kind of European sport economy, which is that at the time, most countries had quota systems, that no team could have more than a few foreign players on the team, right? So these were essentially like protectionist things, that the idea being that a country needed to sustain its own athletes and they didn't want to have too many foreigners coming in. Now he took this to the European court and said that was illegal, essentially, that kind of was a breach of kind of laws in the European Union, and won that case in 1995. So that afterwards, no European country could actually restrict the number of European, it was European players, but from other countries, right? So suddenly, there's this market that kind of explodes, and transfers within Europe take off, and salaries kind of skyrocket. And it also provides an in, even though it didn't apply to foreign players, it does provide an in for foreign players, because if a player can come in and get naturalized in any European country, then they can go to any other team, right? So what develops in part in this context is a kind of economic system in which what exists now is a system in which European clubs kind of can essentially speculate on players from overseas. And they can work with, and there are academies as well in West Africa, these academies and academies elsewhere. And if they can find a young player who's very promising and essentially kind of bring them over to Europe, often with very low salaries, and then they can kind of get them into a position where they're marketable, they can sell them then to other teams with very high transfer fees, right? So it's a mechanism through which, like, not very wealthy clubs in Europe can actually make a decent amount of money if they find a player with promise, bring them in for a few years. Ideally, if they can arrange to get them naturalized, which helps because then they can go to more teams. And then they're kind of then can get sold. And there's a lot of, they can be then sold to a big premier club or a first division club and so forth. So one of the kind of ethical dimensions, that is of course concerns about this. There are all kinds of concerns about this process, right? In some ways, it's like other forms of labor migration, but it has particular forms. It takes particular forms. On one level, it's let me think here how I want to lay out. The kind of quandaries, right? And there are even people, and there's films, there's even people describe this at times as like a slave trade, right? Which is a strong way to put it. But there's a sense that there's this kind of large trade in people who are relatively powerless in what happens. In other words, they often are not themselves paid many salaries. It's clubs that kind of exchange a fair amount of money. And especially there's a large number of people that go into the system for whom it doesn't play out at all, right? In other words, who arrive in Europe in these situations, often with temporary visas, and then end up in a kind of like undocumented situation in Europe, and there are actually organizations that particularly address this. And because it involves often very young people, right, people who might be 15, 16, 17, there's a kind of issue around that as well. So that's just to kind of identify this, this sort of space within Europe that people are debating about this. Now, I just wanted to lay some of that out, and then I'm going to just highlight sort of a couple of what I think of as kind of ethical issues that this raises, right? And that are, I think, true broader of kind of sports economy more broadly, or just things that I think the sports economy is like other forms of economy in many ways, obviously, but there are sort of particularities to it that we should pay attention to. The first and most obvious is that it's an economy in which the likelihood of success is tiny, if not infinitesimal, right? In other words, the likelihood that someone who embarks on an attempt to become a professional athlete will actually succeed in doing so at a decent level is very small, right? It's just a kind of the sort of the way that it works, or the number of people trying to get into a certain number of slots. So now that is true of other careers, of course, too, that it's hard to get to the very top of certain things. The difference in part in sports is that the number of rungs in between that would be, sort of okay for someone are not there, right? In other words, being like a pretty good lawyer is an option. Being maybe a mid-level manager is an option, but basically for those who don't reach the top in athletics, there's a few alternatives, right? But there's not that many alternatives, especially in academy situations where someone's been trained like purely for that, right? So this is obviously a distinction to some extent with the US example. So there's that. That just kind of poses an ethical quandary, like how does this really make sense for this much energy to go into producing a tiny number of people who pursue this career? Part of the reason I think this raises ethical issues is because of the increasingly young age at which these sort of things are set. In other words, the moment, for instance, in France or other countries where a family decides that their child is going to focus entirely on athletics is very, very young, right? So, academies start at 8, 9. A lot of people's decisions are made by 12, 13. So there's a kind of, issue about the sort of relative youth of people and the very early professionalization, I guess, is how we might describe it. Obviously, it raises kind of interesting and complicated issues. Now, of course, the extremely small door open to professional success, I think, of athletics is generally, can be justified largely by the claim that, of course, the practice of sports has other forms of good, right? That it kind of provides a moral good for those who practice it by inculcating teamwork, virtue, all those sorts of things, right? So it's obviously not exclusively a professional career, and to the extent that it is practiced widely, it's understood to be something that anyone who practices gains something from, right? And obviously that's part of, think that you can't think about it exclusively as an economic form. You have to think about that social framework as well. But it is true, of course, that while there's a way in which some of our ideas of sports and education, which were cultivated in the 19th century when when these sports were actually codified through 2 minutes, were codified through educational institutions. That maybe those models of how it works might shift because of these economic things. I'm in injury time already. Oh my gosh. Ow! Right. Okay. The last thing I'll just say, though, just simply, is that the kind of interesting other side of this is that those who succeed in the sporting economy are, of course, incredibly prominent, right? Are in fact probably about the most famous people in the world. They're more beloved and famous than heads of state, certainly than any writers or intellectuals. So they're incredibly present as icons, and people associate very, very tightly with them as icons, and of course as commodifiable icons. So that's interesting. And I think that's something to think about. And they're also very present just in the media sphere. And I'll just conclude by saying that finally, the reason, of course, that the attraction, despite all of these sort of strange formations of the market, as you see it, the reason that there's so much attraction in a sense is partly because whatever else you might say, it still seems to be a place where a kind of actual justice can take place, right? In other words, where social background or networks play less of a role than they do in other domains of social or economic life, so that in fact, someone's kind of success on the field is kind of incontrovertible, cannot be denied based on who they are. And so there is a kind of sense that this, whatever their distortion, sport embodies a kind of, a meritocracy or a democratic possibility. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So next we have Achille Mbembe, and I'm guessing that you're named after like the most famous runner of all time. The one whose career was ended by an injury like Lou Gehrig's, coincidentally, that just happened to be named have the same name as him.
No, I wish I had become a real soccer player. I'll just make a few telegraphic remarks. I think Laurent laid out the field quite clearly. The first one has to do with what seems to me to be a major tension when it comes to soccer, since that's the way you call it here, we call it football, soccer in Africa. It seems to me that, as Laurent intimated, one of the major transformations of soccer in Africa in the last, I would say, 10-15 years has been its internationalization. It's no longer just a local game. It has become international. It has become international at a time I would call of hyper-financialization of the game. Hyper-financialization translating in terms of the emergence, especially in Europe, of a few mega clubs owning a lot of money, dominating basically the major championships, Real Madrid, Barcelona, Chelsea, Man United, AC Milan, and so forth and so on. So African soccer becomes international, emerges in the international scene at a time when matters of money and financing have become extremely important. And the gap between big clubs and smaller ones is increasing. I mean, I would be absolutely astonished if Newcastle United were, for instance, to win the Champions League in England. The Champions League, the championship in England is basically fought right now between 3 or 4 teams. Man United, Chelsea, Arsenal, and to a lesser extent, Tottenham Hotspurs or Man City. So by internationalization of African soccer, I mean therefore the immigration of the best African players to Europe. You find them not only in the former colonies, France, UK, but also in places such as Italy, Spain. You find them in Eastern Europe more and more, in Russia. You also find them in Turkey. You also find them in the Arabian Gulf, in places like Qatar, so forth and so on. So the constitution of a huge diaspora of sportsmen and women, in this case more men than women, which is, it seems to me, a major cultural feature of our times. To the point where during the last World Cup, Laurent was there, almost no African team had any local player. I mean, there were very few. Ghana a little bit, South Africa, but Cameroon, for instance, didn't have any. Cote d'Ivoire, none. This is quite significant. So that tension seems to me is raising new issues we might hopefully deal with during the discussion. The second major tension I would like to signal is that between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. The two driving forces in African soccer are, on the one hand, nationalism, and on the other hand, cosmopolitanism. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism in the sense that most African players, especially those who play abroad, have a double belonging. First of all, they belong to the clubs that pay them on a monthly basis, sometimes lots of money. And on the other hand, they belong to their countries of birth. And it happens more and more that these forms of belonging do clash, especially during the African Cup of Nations, which happens every 2 years. Most African players have to go back to Africa, play for a month, depending on the progression of their national teams. During that time, they lose their position in their clubs. Some of them have seen their career being destroyed precisely because of having responded positively to the national cause. So this has had some serious consequences, to the point where the African Confederation of Football has now decided that they would change the mechanisms of hosting these big tournaments in the continent, which is a major tournament in the sense that that's where younger players have the chance to show what they can do. It's a major market in any case. So we see how global market, in this case, is somewhat contradicting the Pan-African market. Now, third point, it seems to me that when we talk about the globalization of African football, we have to very clearly keep in mind the fact that processes of globalization go hand in hand with what I call the reinvention of difference. There's no way in which we can think of globalization without those processes of reinvention of difference. And it is at the interface of these two processes that I think African soccer stars are made. And as Laurent said, there are not many of them, in fact. I mean, there are many African players playing in Europe, but there are not many stars. I could mention names like Samuel Eto'o, who played for Barcelona, is now with Inter Milan, Drogba, who plays for Chelsea, to a lesser extent somebody like Essien, but that's about it. Which it would be interesting to compare with what's going on, for instance, in Latin America, where the tradition of stardom in Europe is probably a bit more established. But people like Eto'o or Drogba, and here again, I think Laurent mentioned this, are extremely rich. Some of them are richer than the heads of states of some of those African countries. These are major public figures whose voices count very much in the public sphere. So, and these are also very young people. Eto'o is 27 years old. Young people who are called upon to pronounce on almost every single important matter. At a time when soccer stars' life is like celebrity lives. In France the other day we had a major scandal because sex and soccer go practically hand in hand, where some established players in the French national team were caught in some prostitute ring and are being taken to the police to be interrogated. And this is very common. So a very ethical dilemma for these young people who achieve stardom at such a young age and who become public figures with lots of money and influence is indeed how is it that they are or not models for all of those who believe in them. The next point I would like to bring to this discussion has to do with the very notion of market, soccer markets. What kind of markets are we talking about? What kind of business are we dealing with? These are, of course, international global markets, as I have just suggested. These are also markets that tend to operate under the form of franchises. The biggest franchise being, of course, FIFA. I'm talking about this because we have just witnessed the World Cup in South Africa, and some of what has happened there is still very fresh in my mind. FIFA is basically a global franchise, a private company, that whenever it organizes the World Cup, wants to enjoy a total monopoly, extraterritorial rights, in the sense that, for instance, in South Africa, the government had to basically suspend most of the laws of the country for FIFA to operate. The government had to, for instance, institute special courts, matters of justice. It had to waive all the rules of immigration so that FIFA could bring in the country whoever they wanted to bring in, including their own police force, therefore denegating what Max Weber, for instance, would qualify as the attributes of state sovereignty, which are what? The monopoly over a specific territory, the monopoly over taxation, and the monopoly over the use of force. So it's a sovereign franchise that operates, that is not so unlike the new forms of instruments of finance we witness today, some of which have led us to the current economic crisis. Sovereign funds, derivatives, so forth and so on, a whole speculative economy. It seems to me that that is one of the ways in which we have to look into this. So what happens then to individual persons in general and African players in it, in a context in which matters of race are still absolutely crucial to the operations of sports worldwide? So I wouldn't speak in terms of new form of slavery, and Laurent was right in pointing to what he pointed to, but I would conclude by saying that in a context where the surreptitious presence of race is conjoined with these new techniques of financing, in a sport that is global, we definitely witness new forms of debt and bondage, which are not necessarily equal to slavery, but which imply necessarily forms of exploitation, some of which are, of course, very historical, the origins of which are historical. And I think I'll stop it there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and talk to you guys about college athletics and commercialism, specifically U.S. college athletics. And I'm going to take what I think is a somewhat unusual position on many college campuses, at least, which is that I think college athletics should actually become more commercial, not less. So that's my take on commercialism for today. I wanted to start out by talking about what is amateurism, and I don't mean in the historical sense, but under the current NCAA definitions of that rule. So the NCAA defines amateurism with the following couple of statements. Student athletes shall be amateurs in an intercollegiate sport, and their participation should be motivated primarily by education and by the physical, mental, and social benefits to be derived. Student participation in intercollegiate athletics is an avocation. That's an interesting choice of word to me for a variety of reasons. And this is my own emphasis here, student athletes should be protected from exploitation by professional and commercial enterprises. The irony and the tension here, of course, is that Division I college football and men's basketball generate professional level revenues. And I had a variety of statistics to cite to you for this, and then I realized this is Duke. You don't need to be told that basketball is a revenue generating sport here. So I'll just skip that part. And note that both big-time college athletics and professional athletics have highly paid coaches and expensive facilities for games and practices. But there is a big difference, or a couple of big differences. While professional teams are owned by investor groups and feature highly paid athletes, college teams are owned by colleges and universities whose official mission is, of course, not primarily athletic accomplishment. And they feature athletes who are technically unpaid, although leaving aside the scandals for a minute, we know that sort of above board, many athletes will receive free tuition, board, and sometimes a small stipend for living expenses. But so the NCAA has this task, really, then, of navigating between the large revenues that are available for intercollegiate men's football and basketball and their broader mission of colleges and universities, and this is not an easy task. As Wayne mentioned, one of my areas of research is the use of what I refer to as public interest rhetoric to facilitate private wealth transfers and the avoidance of laws that we would just necessarily apply to more nakedly commercial enterprises. In other words, people who say they're doing stuff that's good for other people and are really doing stuff that's good for themselves. The issues that I work on most frequently in this connection are, as we mentioned, sort of more traditional taboo trades or forbidden markets. Things such as reproductive technology, surrogacy, adoption, sex work, organ markets, and the like. But there are distinct parallels in sport, and particularly in amateur sport, to that. And that's the primary reason that I'm interested in sport. And my point here is that there are, in fact, many large and profitable industries that are shrouded with a certain romanticism. An insistence that the parties involved aren't really motivated by profit-seeking and by traditional commercial interests, but by something else. In the case of the reproductive markets, for example, that I was telling you I frequently work on, that something else is usually packaged as giving the gift of life, helping infertile couples to conceive. And it is also characterized by an asserted need to protect the suppliers in that market. That would be surrogates, egg donors, adoptive parents, from the forces of commercialism. And the result that we see in that market is sometimes quite blatant anti-competitive behavior that is just sort of per se illegal in industries that we recognize as being commercial, as opposed to assumed to be people being motivated by something else. Of course, this idealism serves another goal beyond just self-interest, and I should be clear about that. And in particular, it allows markets to flourish that otherwise might collapse under the weight of social disapproval. Mothers are supposed to love their offspring, they're not supposed to sell them for profit, and it would be very difficult for either surrogates, egg donors, or the intended parents of children conceived through those methodologies to come to terms with interacting in this marketplace if we really did recognize it as being a marketplace like any others. So it performs an important social function of allowing the market to work. Now, the parallel in college sport, as you know, is this ideal of amateurism and the love of the game. We also, in this context, see a similar asserted need to protect the suppliers, in this case, college athletes, from the damaging forces of commercialism. The most obvious example, of course, that you're all familiar with is the ban on paying college athletes and all of the many ways that one gets around that. But there are numerous lesser manifestations that you can see that are designed to, again, protect athletes from being exploited by commercialism or by professional forces. Some of those restraints only work also because they're facilitated by NBA or NFL rules about eligibility limits. Just to give one example, Rebecca and I were talking about it earlier, of these lesser restrictions, and one that's been in the news lately. I'm sure this one drives me the most crazy because I am in fact a lawyer. The no agent rule is one that really gets to me. It's primarily an issue in baseball, for those of you who have been following it. But the refusal to allow this refusal to allow the representation of a young person in connection with negotiating away rights for the very long term is something that I just think we would not tolerate in other contexts. So there are a variety of ways then that we need to recognize that the concept of amateurism facilitates NCAA immunity, or at least the lesser application of a wide variety of laws. Everything from antitrust to labor to tax is different because of our notions of amateurism and what an amateur is. Again, as I said before, with respect to other idealized markets, amateurism serves a purpose, right? Much like our notions of sort of altruism and giving the gift of life in connection with reproductive markets. Amateurism serves a purpose beyond its sort of avoiding legal rules, and that's viewership, right? We would, of course, have to ask ourselves whether fans are willing to watch what is a subpar athletic performance without the veneer of amateurism attached to it. And many people think that they would not, in fact, do that. So I guess I just wanted to conclude then with thinking about what are some of the effects of this coupling with the notion of amateurism with the reality of large commercial revenues in college athletics. And there are several. First, evidence that the best college athletes are paid below a competitive level of compensation. That won't be surprising to you, I think. And bear in mind, of course, that when we're talking about the compensation of a college athlete, it's more than just their tuition and room and board. There are a lot of other things that go into that. For example, some top athletes might be admitted to schools that they otherwise would not be admitted to. That's a benefit. They have access to high-level training and coaching and media attention that they wouldn't otherwise get, and future revenue streams, and that's a benefit. But even accounting for those, which is admittedly difficult to do, there's quite a bit of evidence that top athletes are significantly sort of undercompensated. Consistent with that, and this is the part you of course see in the news all the time, is the widespread incidence of under-the-table payments to top athletes. Also, as I think actually both of the prior speakers have mentioned, it's sort of very, it's easy to say, well, it's hard to feel sorry for somebody who's going to go pro in the NBA and make a whole lot more money than I ever thought about making in my life. But do bear in mind, of course, that only, I think the last numbers I have are 1.3% of NCAA football players and 1.7% of NCAA basketball players ever make it to the pros, right? So this sort of, light at the end of the tunnel is not available to all. And then finally, and this actually is directly related to, I think, your conclusion, the effects of this monopsony power, this buyer's cartel, over revenue-producing college athletes is not racially neutral. So the participants in Division I men's basketball and football are disproportionately African American. In the 1990s, while African American students comprised only about 7% of undergraduates at Division I schools, 41% of football players and 60% of basketball players at these schools were black. And in contrast, just to compare that to example for minority representation in coaching, you know that there's a vast distinction there, right? So a study from 1990 to the 2000 period found that only 3.8% of college football coaches were black. So amateurism has some pluses, of course, and I don't want to imply that it doesn't, but it has costs as well. I think it's important to focus on those costs and to also recognize that those costs are not evenly distributed either across the population or across the student body. So that's it.
Michael actually is one of the people that the hall talked about, one of the very few who found a rung between being a sports superstar and working in post office.
Right.
Fortunately, he was a halfback for Harvard, so that there was always a second possibility.
Leaving ancient history behind, it is very interesting that our first two speakers' names are refer to something in particular. Laurent and Akil, both were names referring to honor, to glory, people concerned with glory. And it goes to the heart of what I want to say about athletics, which is, I don't know anybody who is an athlete who got into the game because they thought they were going to get paid. Okay? I mean, the reason people get into sports is they like competition. They like competing with one another. The oldest piece of literature that we have available, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is chapter 2, is a wrestling match between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. You know, and that's, in a way, the high point of the book. It is, who's the stronger, who's the better, who's the, I find myself watching pickup basketball games when I'm walking down the street and somebody's playing at a playground. Why? We enjoy competition. We enjoy competing with one another. It's more sublimated in lots of academic fields, but boy, let me tell you, if you want to know what competition is really about, you ought to join an academic department and find out how willing people are to compete. So I think competition is something very important. It's something that's intrinsically human. It's how we come to understand who we are. Now, at different points in time, athletics, which the term itself means something agonistic, a struggle, and refers to pain, it's something painful. Now, why do people, and it's a kind of a complexity, why do people engage in activities that require incredible amounts of pain, right, in order to get nothing but honor? Well, that's social prestige, position, plays a very important role in our lives. And, whether amateur or professional, there are lots of professional basketball players, for example, who takes enormous pay cuts to play on a team where they're going to win, right? Because they want to win. They want that championship ring. That's crucial for them. Professional football players, if you talk about American football players, talk about exploitation, they give up 20 years of life expectancy to play professional football, right? The average life expectancy of professional football players is just over 60 years, right? They give up a huge amount in terms of what they do. But if you ask them if they're willing to make that sacrifice, almost every one of them would tell you yes. Now, there certainly are compensations. Social prestige leads to all kinds of goodies that you get with being in basketball. As a former professional basketball player told me about his career at UNC, you do what you want, you screw who you want. I mean, that's what life was like. So it wasn't, they weren't getting paid, but they were, the stars in all kinds of ways.
I didn't include that in my list of
You didn't include that, right? This is not new, right? I mean, there are three varieties of sports that have sort of come to constitute modern sport: Greek sport, Roman sport, and British sport. Greek sport was all individual sport, right? There were no team sports. The only team sports in the ancient world were played by Spartan women, a ball game. Everything else was completely individual. If you won five major competitions in a row, you were allowed to call yourself Hercules, right? You were given a godlike name. There are any number of hero worship cults in the ancient world for athletes who were successful. And they cheated out the wazoo. I mean, they had special diets. They took whatever drugs they could to get better. That was not new, right? But it was completely individualized. It wasn't team sport. British sport is almost entirely, in its origins in the 19th century, team sport, right? And playing by the rules of the game, fairness, what falls under the rubric of amateurism came to be very popular, especially with the beginnings of cricket and what was then called football became on one hand rugby and on another hand soccer and then on another hand American football. Being fair and competing was very important. And so soccer is originally in the public school league, when if you committed a foul, you withdrew your goalie until the other team scored, right? Now that seems absurd to us until you recognize that those same boys that were playing soccer there were going to go off to India and try to rule an empire where they looked a lot different than everybody else around them. So it was really crucial that they be able to trust the people that were with them. So, in a way, those are two aspects of sports, both that individual excellence aspect that you see with the Greeks, even though it was commercialized, and that team sport that we tend to admire about sports. There's another form of sports, Roman sports, right? Roman sports was sports practiced by slaves. Free men were not allowed to participate in gladiatorial games, right? It was principally a spectator sport. And it was a spectator sport that paid huge revenues for some of the gladiators. There were some men that sold themselves into slavery so they could become gladiators. Right? But the goal of those games was to demonstrate the power of the state. Right? So that when they began each of the gladiatorial games, their repeated refrain was, "We who are about to die salute you." I mean the emperor, the head of the games, or the sit-in for the emperor, the proconsul. The consequence of that was that, and we see, well, the consequence of that for us is we still see that in our games. Before every game, what do we have? A national anthem. It's true in European countries, it's true in African countries. It's bound up with all of the nationalism. Somehow those athletes are thought to be representative of the spirit of the country in which they reside. That kind of competition plays an important role. Now, one of the things that we know about the development of sport in the 19th century is that it became widely popular, especially soccer and rugby, became widely popular in England. First in public schools, what are really private schools in England. And then among what were called old boys clubs. The old boys clubs were clubs of men who had left public school, who missed the team sport aspect that they'd become so acquainted with, started clubs in various cities that grew into the athletic clubs, the soccer teams that we know today. They became increasingly popular among displaced workers who had come from the countryside, didn't have anything else to hang on to, and they became city men or Tottenham men, or they became fans of a particular team, and that gave them a greater sense of community and a greater sense of identity in the new industrializing cities that they found themselves in. With the development from professionalism, from amateurism to professionalism, amateurism was originally an invented category meant to keep the hoi polloi, the working class, out of sports, and to give the aristocrats who had time to practice and wealth to afford practice an opportunity to get ahead. So, moving towards a more professional sport was really one way to give greater opportunity to a wider number of people to participate in sports. Right? So what does all this have to do with us? One of the things that we've noted, and I think it really comes out in all three of the talks that came before, was that what's happened in our time is the commercialization of sports. And I would want to argue that that is really, in a certain sense, the Romanization of sports. Sports have become much more dependent upon spectators and upon audience and upon a communications industry that makes that all available That has a couple very important consequences. The first of which is that our players become less free individuals who are aiming at demonstrating their own excellence and become much more involved in an economic nexus of exchange. Right? That's just inevitable. Now, I don't want to say that I think I disagree. I don't think that the people that are playing professional soccer at the highest levels are exploited. As I say, they give up a lot, but it is really a winner-take-all society in these professional sports, and that is one of the phenomena that has characterized globalization. Right? It characterized the Roman world as well. To be in Rome, to be in the center, you made tons more money than you did playing, in the provincial cities. Well, there used to be 88 opera houses in Iowa. Today there are 0. Why is that? Because you can go out and buy a CD that's got all the opera on it. We can name probably more soccer players than anybody else, but most people can only name 2 or 3. The people at the very top of the profession are rewarded with extraordinary amounts. As Coach K told me on one occasion, LeBron James and Kobe Bryant are corporations. They have people that travel around with them. They are their own marketing organization. They make hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Right? So those people, so one of the reasons so many people look like they're exploited, it seems to me, is that when they get into this, once they've risen above the level of, let's say, college sports, where a lot of people get they get an education, maybe not as good an education as they would if they weren't athletes, but then a lot of them wouldn't get educations if they weren't athletes. And we know that athletes make more money, even when you control for professional sports, down the road than non-athletes do, right? It has to do with time management, hard work, et cetera, et cetera. But what happens when people enter into this professional arena is they really do give up a whole number of degrees of liberty in pursuit of that top prize. Very few of them get there, but that's a kind of, it's like playing the lottery, right? There's no surer way to lose money than to play the lottery. If all those kids that were playing in all those minority neighborhoods around basketball around America 8 hours a day in order to make it to the NBA would be reading at home, they'd all be making, on average, lots more money than they do now. So, it does have that effect. Are there other prizes that people get for being in sports other than the money they paid? I think there are lots of them. My own view is, I would sort of, I don't want to echo Kim, but I think all students ought to have a sports requirement. I'd like to see every student involved in sports because it's a unique kind of experience that really makes it much easier for people to compete in the real world when they get out there than our current academic experience. So, exploitation, yes. A lot of it is self-exploitation and people making bad judgments about risks of getting ahead. Young people have done that from time immemorial. That's why men became soldiers for lots and lots of years thinking someday they would become a commander. That's why lots of women figure skate thinking they're going to be, the Olympic star or, et cetera, et cetera. Gymnastics, the same thing. Opera, singing and playing a musical instrument. How many of you play a musical instrument? Lots of you. And lots played musical instruments really, really well. When I was in college, I had 3 people that lived in my dorm. All 3 had won national competitions. One won the national violin competition. The other won a national piano competition. The other won a cello competition. One of them now is a doctor. One of them teaches 7-year-old kids how to play the piano, and the other is Yo-Yo Ma, right? One. They were already all national champions. Only one made a living doing that. So I think there are all kinds of markets in which people take absurd chances. But I'm not sure I would exactly call that exploitation.
No, to me it's only exploitative because we set their wages.
Well, no, right. Well, we set their wages, and look, it's really hard to, if you follow these negotiations as Kim and I do, to see the man who owned the second biggest stockholder in Microsoft complain about losing a couple $1 million with the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, and therefore the players should get back more money. That's absurd. But those are, I think, owners and the owners of these teams and the managers of these teams, to go back to your model of prostitution, are a little bit more like pimps. Yeah. Right. They do some, their organizational work plays some role, but boy, they get lots of, well, unlike pimps who don't get arrested, they get to be on TV.
They get higher status.
Thank you very much, Mike.
I don't think I've ever been in that conference, and the last word was pimp.
Okay, well. I think it was TV actually, but close enough.
So we have about 20 minutes left for discussion. There's lots of themes that have been winding through all of the presentations and some emerging tensions and points of agreement. Obviously about exploitation or manipulation, whether it's sort of some of the winners or of the many that sort of don't get out of the soccer academies, or if they're naive families in a village somewhere in the middle of Nigeria. Questions about whether amateurism still has any relevance whatsoever, and whether the model that Kim has presented for how we cloak some of these oddball markets sometimes in notions like amateurism or their equivalents in order to make them function in a way that would be hard to do otherwise, whether that works, what amateurism means. And in general about what these sorts of global markets tell us about globalization in general. Are these like when mining companies go to developed nations or apparel manufacturers, or are these not like those? So any questions, comments? Yeah, and you can say who you are.
My name is Charlotte. I had a question for anyone, I guess, but it's regarding sort of, I feel like there was a sort of sense in everyone's talk about how there's this moral foundation that's built within a sport of sportsmanship and honor and all the sort of great things that come from the sport, but then I feel like there's almost a sense of the wider business of sport, that it's this exploitation and you were saying, do what you want, screw who you want, you know, like that kind of thing. I feel like there's this sort of clash of morals between the sport itself and then the sort of surrounding aspects of the sport. I don't know if that's necessarily a question or what's a discussion topic. I just don't know sort of.
Albert Camus said once the only place he ever learned ethics was on a soccer field. Right?
He learned most surely about the morality of man in
right.
playing soccer. Yeah.
Right.
But that says a lot about the French.
Well, he came from
he was also a goalie.
If he had studied it all.
He was a goalie.
Yeah. But I think we do learn, and I think the point about justice was an important one. We learn a lot about what justice is by watching sports, and a lot of our models for what justice is come from sports. We often in any financial transaction feel like we got screwed. Right? I mean, this happens over and over again. You buy a new car, you know, you always feel like it costs too much, right? But both parties, almost invariably, everybody feels that way, right? And partly it's because of the way markets work, right? Somebody brings ice and is selling you a $10 bottle of ice after a hurricane. You feel like that's wrong. They shouldn't be doing that, but you really want the ice. Nobody else has it, so you pay that much. So I think part of the reason that we feel like we're being exploited often in those cases is because somebody's making more money, has a greater profit in the transaction than we do. There wouldn't be a transaction if both people weren't getting something that they preferred out of it to what they currently have. Right? Parents make bad decisions, and not just in rural Africa, but all over America, in terms of pushing their kids, like just to do sports. I used to push my son to play soccer. You know, I would tell him, get out there, juggle the ball. He said, Dad, I'm doing calculus. Okay, well, I said, okay, well, yeah, you're right. So calculus is better than juggling the ball. But you know, we understand that. I mean, the parents pressure kids to do things, and especially when you see a kid who's got real athletic talent, and you know, and I coach youth soccer, kids who come from the ghetto, who are scholarship players, who have real talent. You know, they might make it, but you have to tell them, look, the chances of your making it, even to get a college scholarship, are small, right? And the chance of being professional, forget it. That's although one of the ones I coached did become a professional player, but that's really, really rare. So it's a terrible bad risk that you take if you put all your eggs in that basket. Right? You're much better off to study trigonometry or calculus or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, well, I'll just add that I think in some ways there's obviously like a rhetoric around sports that, again, really was developed. I mean, it's a British rhetoric around sports, and it's even not the Roman rhetoric, even though the Roman model might show us what we're dealing with right now. But and I think in some ways that's kind of imbued in sort of ideology of the sport, and it's there. At the same time, it's also not the whole story. I mean, in other words, the practice of the sport itself is itself very complicated, right? And it involves injustice and, you know, failure that's not really fair. I mean, sports are not fair. You know, everybody knows that. There's an idea that you might learn certain things. But I mean, I always think with Camus, in some ways, you know, he also wrote that basically what he learned as a goalie is that the ball like never comes from where you expect it, right? Which is essentially like existentialism. You know, there's a way in which what did he mean when he learned about the morality of man? It wasn't that the world is fair and just. It's also this kind of like insane way in which little tiny things can make all the difference and mean that you lose, or you know what I mean. And I think
and all the 10 guys that let the ball get through
them exactly.
are blaming you for letting the ball go in.
But I think one of the reasons sports are so powerful is because they are so interesting, actually, at laying out these incredibly complex human dilemmas, you know, in that sense. So you know, when the Olympics and the World Cup were both invented by French guys of the same generation, Pierre de Coubertin and Jules Rimet, and it's interesting because they had a very different sense. One, the Olympic was the amateur ideal, which was a kind of elevated sense, and for Rimet, he basically thought that was hopelessly elitist. That if you try to take business out of sports, then what you essentially meant is you left it to rich people, right? So that as long as sports were not professionalized, they were going to be elite, right? So that there's a way he believed actually that the market was essential to making it kind of, you know, in some ways actually more accessible. So just to say that I think, I mean, it's sometimes true. It's easier to say there's a dichotomy, but in a certain way, there's obviously a lot more overlap.
So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in, but maybe we should get a couple more questions out onto the floor and then have some more stuff. Maybe we could take perhaps three questions before we go on. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Jeffrey Ritchie. I have a comment and a question. The first one's about the African Cup of Nations, which is held every 2 years, January and February, much to the anger of European clubs who own these players and have to see them go back to Africa in the middle of the European season. So there's a collective groan in Europe every time this tournament is played. And I've always admired the fact that they're stubbornly insisting, and they're some of the most expensive, valuable players in the world, they're stubbornly insisting on holding this tournament in January and February. And you're telling me, Ashia, that they're really changing it so they don't fit the European season schedule. That's astonishing. I'm going to follow how that goes because that's always been a huge symbol of resistance. My question has to do with also that we see a backlash, just as there's sort of a backlash against the processes of globalization in terms of the immigration debates in Europe and the cultural debates, especially centered around Islam. It's correlative in soccer would be, there's a lot of debates about African players, but we've thrown the doors wide, so open, they're overwhelming our ability to produce local players. They're changing the way we play soccer because they're perceived as being more physical and having a different style of play. So there's a rule being debated about homegrown player rule, where they're going to undo, I think, mentioned 1995, 1995, where now 6 players, I think, of every starting lineup have to have European citizenship to undo the process of the free market. I was just wondering what thoughts you have about that, or if I even have that story right. Yeah. Okay,
can we just hold the answer? We'll get a few more questions out on the floor and then ask them also.
Yeah.
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Hashim Al-Wazan. I have two questions. One, and a comment like before that is that every time I discuss sport and ethics, I think of the movie Gladiator. So I mean, I think it represents like a lot of what we're talking about here. First question I have is about Zinedine Zidane and what happened like at last World Cup in the final. I don't know. Like I'd like to like understand if you have like any information on like what happened exactly and about that event. And the second question is about sport injuries in Africa and like in the Middle East or like in the outside like Europe or the US here, where a lot of people are just, you know, if you get injured, then no one takes care of you, and that's like a sad case in the Middle East and in Africa, I guess so.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Patrick has his hand in the corner, and then we'll come over here, and then we should have enough time to take these two, and then have enough time for some answers.
All right, I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. It's a pretty popular book. But I was interested in wondering how you guys think we should apply ethics to the recruitment process, especially for young kids in sports like hockey today, and if that should be changed, because obviously it's unfair that it's decided if you're a hockey player or not based on what month you're born in.
Yeah, just to elaborate, he just sort of crunched the numbers, and I think if you're born in a certain month, then you get into a there's a cutoff for getting into I forgot which league it is, and then that ends up having, and then you end up playing. Otherwise, you have to then play with kids who are a bit older than you or something, and so you're less likely to develop. And last question.
Hi, my name's Tim. I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel believes that college athletes should be paid, since it seems like they bring in so much like tremendous revenue to the schools, but they receive a scholarship and maybe an education they don't even want. So I was wondering, since so many of them actually don't even make it to the professional levels, like should they be paid like maybe this is like 4 years in college where they actually can make a little money? And since they're already helping the school like bring in so much money, like maybe they should also take a cut.
Okay. Are we going to add one more quick question? Yeah.
I was actually kind of asking a very similar thing. Kind of so to add to that, we read in our class about Dan Ariely's kind of idea of social versus market norms, and I was going to say, do you think that if you were to pay college athletes, it would take away the whole honor and glory of being a college athlete if they were paid some like not that great, say they were paid like $30,000 a year. Every kid wants $30,000.
Like AAA baseball players or something.
Yeah, it's just something really, you know, not a huge salary by any means, but would it take away that honor and glory by making it a market thing instead of this like social glory position?
Yeah. So let's. So we have a question on protectionism, on sort of the problem of injuries, which didn't really come up very much except in Michael's talk about what happens to professional players. But obviously, one of the things that happens is that promising athletes get injured at the college level or in the soccer academy, and they never do kind of get their shot. Problems about paying college athletes, and then the outlier problem. So.
I do favor paying college athletes, and what that means is because not all schools have money generating sports though. It's that sports, as we know it now, might disappear from some campuses. So there's a trade-off to that. But I think people should be paid. Yeah. And so to go to your point, I would just say that the people can decide for themselves, right, whether they want to give up the honor and the glory of amateurism in exchange for money. My problem with the current sports as currently structured is that that's really not an option left to players. So throughout most areas of life, we allow people to make these trade-offs ourselves. I mean, many of us gave up more money in private industry, for example, for the benefits that come with this job.
Actually, just you did. The rest of us are just doing it as well.
So I would just say that this is a choice that individuals, we let other individuals make these choices, even at a young age. And I don't see why athletes shouldn't be allowed to make them as well. There are some complications with how the system would work that we could talk about for about 82 hours. But
Can I just add one point on that? Yes, Chair's program. I think if you come from outside the country, it's totally weird that college sports are popular and is popular in something like the NCAA tournament, because in no other country do the second or third divisions of a soccer league or the under-21 championships or the minor leagues or the develop. I mean, that's just not an interesting spectator sport. Everybody recognizes that's inferior to watching the best spectacle. So we have this weird thing in America where it's incredibly lucrative for all sorts of players, not just universities, but other media interests, etc. And there is a risk that all of that would disappear. That we would that college football and college basketball would be like minor league hockey and minor league baseball, where the Durham Bulls might get 4,000 people out to a playoff game, but nobody else does. So there's and I think Kim had kind of pointed out there's this risk that you don't have to tweak very many things before this whole illusion that creates what is wonderful about March Madness and college bowl games could just disappear when we realize it's just second-rate players.
Just on point of information, there's 7 colleges and 7 universities in the country that make money on sports. To pay college football and basketball players, we'd have to do it over Title IX, which is women's sports, which seems to me to be the first manifestation of the amateur ideal.
I mean, the Title IX thing is obviously something I struggle with a lot because these are, in fact, the revenue-generating sports funded. And being a woman who likes sports, I want women to be able to participate in sports. I mean, this again would be a conversation that we could have for about 10 hours. But I think the way I've just come to terms with this is that a lot of the benefits for women in sport come at an earlier age than college. And I think that a system could be had where we focused on that earlier. And again, to go back to the lack of equality here, a lot of college students, including female college students, playing sports is just not that's just not an option for them, right? Whereas in college, whereas engaging in a lesser form, a less rigorous and time-consuming form of physical education when they're young would have a lot of benefits.
But there are schools like Williams where 60% of the student body is varsity athletes. I mean, that's
Any last comments? We have about a minute left for other two
I was
panelists
just
on other
thinking about
questions. that come
what has happened during the last World Cup in South Africa when, at the very last minute of the game between Ghana and Uruguay, this Uruguayan player grabbed the ball with his hands, and he was not even a goalkeeper. So a flagrant instance of cheating, which reminds us of other instances, the hand of God of Maradona and of that. So of course, I mean, morality and sports, there's a relationship there. But it seems to me that what is really interesting in soccer in particular, it's under what circumstances that you can cheat, and how is it that you make cheating beautiful?
Well, and why they don't have more referees? Why they don't
But
have
that's the
more
problem.
referees?
That's what I'm coming to. Because what is interesting in the sport is of course, I mean, the rules and all that, but it's the unpredictability and the manufacturing of a drama. If you go to a soccer game where there is no drama, you go home and you are not exhausted. But you are exhausted when there is a drama. So I'm just wondering what type of correlation one might envisage between demand for some form of ethical reason in sports and the inner logic of a sport that thrives on drama, and therefore allows for a modicum of cheating.
Yeah, and I'll just conclude. Please. I think that's the thing, is that this symbolic configuration around athletics is so rich and complex. I mean, if historians aren't supposed to predict the future, but however much it might be advisable to change the system, I see very little likelihood that it will change in American colleges, because it's actually a cultural and social matrix that has been developed over a long time and that is now operative in many ways for a lot of people, and it's symbolically very operative, And so, in a sense, I think we'll continue to have these debates for a long time, but in effect, the sort of all the things that you mentioned about the glory and the status, and just there is something very compelling about the athletic, the person who people watch. I mean, we watch the World Cup together, and there's just kind of like nothing like it, right? There's a way in which, just in terms of the pleasure, the drama that was involved, the communities produced around it. I mean, that's just very, very powerful, and it's not, reasonable in some, you can't really parse out why it's the case, but it's nevertheless an experience that is extremely compelling, and sort of and those relationships, I think, dominate. So I don't think it will ever really make sense, it's gonna, but I think it's gonna continue to operate as a symbolic cultural matrix, partly because it allows us to think about, like, the full range of human existence in all its weirdness, right? In other words, it's almost anything you can talk about, you can think, well, that's why we all use sports metaphors, because there's in a way something for everyone within it, and that's why I think it'll retain.
Wait, can I build a question on something you just said?
Oh, you are here, Claire.
Yeah, hi.
Have you always been here?
No, I
You just sail in and ask a question.
Beat myself in. I'm Claire Concise, and I teach a course on sport and performance in theater studies and other departments. Jane's one of the students. But you just mentioned the World Cup, and I want to bring it back to this global aspect of this panel, because we're all really invested in U.S. college sports, which is a phenomenon that's unlike anywhere else in the world. But I want to come back to the global thing. So I spent a lot of time in China, right? And the World Cup is just huge in China. And China is a country that has only had its team in the World Cup once, and they did hard. It was 2006, and they didn't do well. I was there when that happened. But this summer I was in China doing my research, and when you said about a building community, I mean, people go nuts. They're like out on the streets, gathered around a television. They're watching it 24 hours a day. There's always a time difference thing going on. And China is not a culture that has adopted our sport mentality. So to what do you attribute the popularity of the World Cup in China, a country that really hasn't adopted soccer so much, hasn't adopted the same sport aesthetic in terms of popular culture that we have, and doesn't have a personal investment with the team in the tournament?
I'm gonna have to let that question just
Sure,
sort of
that's fine.
freeze in the air. With the promise that there are three more events coming up.
Sure.
The next one in particular on October 21st is about this whole nexus of rules and sportsmanship and gamesmanship, where we've just started to get into it, and she's sort of reminded us of some of the dynamics of that. And then we've got two other events to still form in the spring, and so we can come back to perhaps other issues that have been left dangling. But I know some people have to scoot. So I appreciate very much everybody coming out, and let me thank heartily my
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.